George Martin comes from humble origins. He was born in 1948 in Bayonne, New Jersey. His father was a dock worker, and the family lived in a low-income housing project by the water.
I do think some of my desire to write and some of my desire to read was motivated by the limits of the life that I led. We didn't have much money to spend. We didn't own a car. My school was on 5th Street. I walked to it, and that was, for all intents and purposes, that was my world. My world was 5 blocks long.
From an early age, George was aware of a lost fortune on his mother's side of the family, the Brady family, who once owned a successful construction business, a dock, and a grand house, all lost in the Great Depression of 1929.
But I had to walk past that house every day on my way from the projects on 1st Street to 5th Street, and it's like, well, that used to be our dock, that used to be our house. Now we don't have a house, we don't have a yard, but I always had this sense of, yeah, I'm poor, but I come from, like, royalty, or I come from greatness that somehow was destroyed by the Depression, by corrupt politicians, by things like that. So maybe that gives me a little of the emotional temperament to understand somebody like Daenerys Targaryen.
What is it you want?
My birthright, the 7 kingdoms of Westeros.
I'm sorry, little princess.
I am not your little princess. I am Daenerys Stormborn of the blood of old Valyria, and I will take what is mine. With fire and blood, I will take it.
Other kids had cars and they got out of town. You know, they took summer vacations down the shore or in the mountains. We couldn't afford to do any of that. We just stayed in the same old apartment in the summer. And I dreamed of being on other planets and living in other times. I was a lonely kid. I was the kid with his nose in the book. I was the last kid picked for games or things like that. I didn't, sports. I was no good at sports. So I spent a lot of time, sitting, reading a comic book, reading a science fiction book. Most of my initial exposure to many of the great works of English literature was through the Classics Illustrated comic books, whether it was, The Time Machine and War of the Worlds to the best Classics Illustrated, or Shakespeare. They did Shakespeare, Hamlet as a comic book. But then I discovered Superman and Batman, and they were much cooler. So I was reading all the superhero comic books. So I think it was really comic books that made me interested in reading and in stories and in heroes.
As a schoolboy, George Martin was writing superhero and science fiction stories for himself, his friends, and for comic fanzines. He still has some of the figurines which inspired those stories.
These are some of my first characters. Most of these are aliens made in the United States in the 1950s and sold in 5 and dime stores. They have no stories, so I made up stories for them, and this is some of my earliest writing. But I decided that these were a gang of space pirates. This guy was from Mars, Jarn. I decided his name was, he was the chief pirate. He was the head of the pirates. And this guy, who was supposedly from Orion, I couldn't figure out this weapon he was holding. It looked like a drill to me, this weird little weapon. So I decided he was the pirate torturer. He would use that drill to drill into your knees or your head and get you to spill your secrets. I was a bloodthirsty little kid even then.
But the black and white comic book world of aliens and monsters, superheroes and villains collided with reality when George went to college in Illinois in 1968 to study journalism. This was the height of the Vietnam War, and George had to rethink his worldview.
I'd come from Bayonne, and, Bayonne was blue-collar and very patriotic, and, the United States can do no wrong, and et cetera. But college was an education for me. I remember being assigned to do a paper to research the Vietnam War, which before that I had just thought about, we're in another war and we're helping poor people defend themselves against evil communist aggression. And then I actually researched the war and the role of the French and, the complexity and the rigged elections, and, suddenly it didn't look at all so clear-cut to me anymore. And I gradually got radicalized, I suppose you would say.
While still a student, George sold his first story, which appeared in the science fiction magazine Galaxy in 1971. The hero is a tale of a battle-weary soldier fighting on a distant planet who wants to retire and return to Earth.
That was definitely an anti-war story and an anti-militarization story. It was actually triggered by people coming back from Vietnam, particularly Green Berets and all that, who'd been trained to respond violently to any kind of threat, and they had a hard time turning this off in civilian life. Well, what if you have someone who's a soldier like that in the future, and he's this killing machine. He's this highly decorated killing machine, and now he wants to go back to civilian life. How do you make him not a killing machine? A couple years later, when I was called up to be drafted, I applied for conscientious objector status. One of the supporting documents I submitted was that story, which was like a couple years before, so it clearly showed anti-military and anti-war sentiments, 2 years before my application, and perhaps gave my application a little more credence, so my draft board did give me conscientious objector status.
Despite taking an anti-war stance over Vietnam, George Martin has constantly returned to warfare as a theme in his fiction.
War is an important subject. It's there. It's all through human history. I mean, you go back and you read history. I've studied history all my life. I've read history. What is history? History is war. History is the history of war. The Romans versus the Carthaginians, the Greeks versus the Persians, the wars of the Italian city-states during the Renaissance, the 100 Years' War, the American Revolution, the British Revolution, the French Revolution. It's all wars and violence. It's the most important subject.
Look at me. Stannis is a killer. The Lannisters are killers. Your father was a killer. Your brother is a killer. Your sons will be killers someday. The world is built by killers. So you better get used to looking at them.
Game of Thrones is set during a bloody civil war, and it portrays war in all its brutality.
Epic fantasy is universally about wars. I mean, Tolkien, and even before Tolkien, E.R. Edison. The heart of epic fantasy always seems to be some great war or another. And to some extent, I think I'm in dialogue, as I write about war, with other fantasists who have gone before me and even my contemporaries.
But unlike most writers of epic fantasy, Martin depicts war as horrific and largely futile, rather than heroic.
It's a complicated issue here. I'm not a complete pacifist. If you believe in war under any circumstances, then you have to say you'd fight in World War II. Come on, the Nazis were the closest thing that the human race has ever reached to orcs. If the Nazis had not existed and we invented them for a fantasy novel, people would say, "Oh, come on, you're going over the top. This is ridiculous." They're cooking people in ovens. They wear all black uniforms. They have skulls on their hats. Come on, this is too much. But that's the reality of the situation. But if you look past World War II, I mean, look at World War I. My God, what a colossal waste of millions of human lives. What was World War I all about? Why did anyone fight in World War I? Why did anyone fight in the War of Jenkins' Ear, the War of the Three Henrys?
You'd have us surrender. End all this bloodshed, I understand. The country would be at peace, and life would be just under the righteous hand of good King Joffrey.
You're going to kill Joffrey?
The gods give me strength.
And then what?
I don't know. We'll go back to Winterfell. I have no desire to sit in the Iron Throne.
So who will?
I don't know.
You're fighting to overthrow a king, and yet you have no plan for what comes after.
First, we have to win the war.
You go back and you look at these thousands of years of wars and what caused them, and, most of the time it just doesn't seem worth it.
George's route to epic fantasy was through a different literary genre. In the 1970s, he was building his career as a science fiction writer. This was a time when the Apollo moon landings were turning science fiction into science fact.
When I was really young, I wanted to be an astronaut and go to the moon and walk on Mars. I used to wonder, would I live long enough to see men walk on the moon? And then By the time I was in college, I saw men walk on the moon, but I never dreamed that I would see men stop walking on the moon. It was great, but it was also... Sometimes when a dream comes true, it's not as cool as the dream.
Martin started to have success with short stories which use space travel and life on other planets as a way of exploring themes of existential loneliness. He traveled to science fiction conventions around the country and shared ideas with fellow writers like his friend Lisa Tuttle.
George is in that kind of cohort, I guess, of writers who were serious about what they were doing, loved science fiction, loved comics and movies, and making up stories set in outer space and thinking about things that didn't happen in this world. But at the same time, they were putting real emotion into it.
One of the big voices in those days was Harlan Ellison. Harlan was always talking about the necessity of writing from the gut, of bleeding onto the page, of, digging deep and getting to powerful emotional material. That was the stuff. And I took that to heart. I said to myself, I need to write some stories that expose my vulnerabilities, that hurt in some sense, that where I'm getting at some truths is the way I see and experience the world.
Martin started to win awards for his stories and went on to write a series of successful novels which reworked popular genres.
He did not write the same book twice. He would write a huge, thick, beautiful space opera set on a dying planet, and then suddenly you're reading a riverboat novel. And suddenly there's vampires happening, and he's a different kind of writer. And it became obvious that George was a writer who wanted to try everything.
I think genre is just a matter of furniture. The furniture doesn't matter. The human heart can be in conflict with itself in a story that takes place in a castle and that has dragons in it, and it can happen on a spaceship 10,000 years in the future, or it can happen in a suburban setting or in the streets of Bayonne, New Jersey. To my mind, it always comes back to the human heart in conflict with itself. What Faulkner said, that is the only thing worth writing about, and that's the thing I always try to write about, regardless of what the setting is.
But when George's fourth novel, The Armageddon Rag, was a commercial failure, he was forced to find work as a writer in television.
My career as a novelist appeared to be over after that book. I couldn't sell my fifth novel.
In 1986, he secured a job on the relaunched classic science fiction series, The Twilight Zone.
Writing short stories and novels is a lonely experience. Going out to Hollywood, suddenly you're part of a staff of writers, and you're taking coffee breaks with them, and you're saying, here's the stuff I'm writing, and they're telling you what they're writing, and you're kicking around ideas, and you have a secretary to make coffee for you, and you watch dailies together of the show that's that somebody wrote yesterday, and you're visiting a set and visiting with actors, and of course you're having meetings with the network and the studio, and you're going to premieres, and you're part of this larger world.
Working as a writer in Hollywood was lucrative, but George found that writing for television had creative limitations.
You write science fiction fantasy, you don't have to worry about budget. You can put anything you want on the page, and the reader's imagination supplies the rest. But when I was writing for Twilight Zone and Beauty and the Beast, and I was constantly getting notes, George, we love this is terrific, but it's 5 times our budget, so can you please cut 3 of these matte paintings, and gosh, you have 27 characters in this thing, could we have 6? And this big battle at the end where 2 armies of 100,000 people are fighting, could that be a duel between the hero and the villains? That would be good.
In one episode of The Twilight Zone, loosely based on the King Arthur legend, George was told he could either have Stonehenge or horses, but not both. It's easy to see how his vision was restricted by the budget.
Oh, stop it, you old goat!
The great side about working for Hollywood television is you are part of a collaborative medium. The bad side, you're part of a collaborative medium. And all these other people have their own ideas. They want to change this, they want to change that, you should rewrite it, the sponsor doesn't like it, the network doesn't like it, censors say this, standards and practices, and that kind of stuff can drive you crazy, and did drive me crazy. after a certain amount of time. You know, I could take it for a while, but at the end it wore me down.